The dust swirled around Miguel Santos like angry spirits as he rode into Copper Creek just before sunset. His dark eyes scanned the wooden buildings that lined the main street, taking note of every shadow, every window, every possible escape route. Years of survival had taught him to see danger before it saw him. The town looked peaceful enough, but Miguel knew better than to trust appearances in this harsh land where the color of a man's skin could mean the difference between a fair trial and a hanging rope. His horse, a sturdy paint mare named Luna, stepped carefully through the rutted street. Miguel had rescued her from a pack of wolves 3 winters ago, and since then they had become inseparable partners in a world that wanted them both dead. The Apache blood that flowed through his veins made him an outcast among the white settlers, while his skill with a gun made him valuable enough to stay alive. It was a delicate balance that required constant vigilance. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood at the heart of Copper Creek, its bat-wing doors swinging gently in the evening breeze. Yellow light spilled from its windows, and the sound of piano music mixed with rough laughter drifted into the street. Miguel tied Luna to the hitching post and checked his Colt .45, making sure it sat loose in its holster. He had learned long ago that preparation often meant the difference between walking out of a place alive or being carried out in a pine box. Inside the saloon, conversations died as Miguel entered. 20 pairs of eyes followed his movement to the bar, where a nervous bartender with thinning hair wiped glasses with shaking hands. Miguel had grown used to this reception. Fear followed him like his own shadow, and he had stopped trying to outrun it years ago. Instead, he had learned to use it as a weapon, letting men's prejudices and assumptions work in his favor when trouble came calling. "Whiskey," Miguel said quietly, placing a silver dollar on the scarred wooden bar. His voice carried the slight accent of his Apache upbringing mixed with the careful pronunciation he had learned during his brief time in the mission schools before running away at 14. The bartender, a man named Eddie Morse, poured the drink with hands that trembled slightly. He'd heard stories about Apache gunslingers, tales that grew larger with each telling around campfires and in saloons across the territory. Some said they could move like ghosts, appearing and disappearing at will. Others claimed they could put 6 bullets through a silver dollar at 50 paces. Eddie wasn't sure what was true, but he knew better than to test the stories. At a corner table, 4 men watched Miguel with growing interest. They wore the dusty clothes of ranch hands, but their eyes held the cold calculation of men who had crossed lines that most folks wouldn't even approach. The leader, a scarred man named Jake Thornton, had been drinking steadily since noon, nursing both whiskey and a grudge that had been eating at him for months. Thornton's younger brother Billy had been killed in a shootout with an Apache gunslinger 6 months earlier, down in Tucson. The description matched the man now standing at the bar, calm as morning mist on a lake. Jake had been hunting this particular Apache ever since, following rumors and stories across 3 territories. Now, it seemed, his patience was about to pay off. Miguel sensed the tension building behind him like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the mood of a room, a skill that had kept him breathing when lesser men would have already been planted in Boot Hill. The whiskey burned his throat as he took a slow sip, his ears tuned to every sound, every whisper, every scrape of chair legs on wooden floors. "You're him, ain't you?" Jake Thornton's voice cut through the saloon like a rusty knife. "The Apache that killed my brother down in Tucson." Miguel turned slowly, his hand hanging loose at his side. He studied Thornton's face, noting the family resemblance to a young man he had indeed faced in a dusty street 6 months ago. That had been a fair fight, called by Billy Thornton himself after a night of drinking and boasting. Miguel had tried to walk away, but sometimes a man's pride wouldn't let him choose the smart path. "Your brother called me out," Miguel said calmly. "I gave him every chance to walk away. He chose his path, just like you're choosing yours right now." The other 3 men at Thornton's table began to spread out, trying to position themselves for a crossfire. Miguel noticed their movement without appearing to watch them directly. He had faced multiple opponents before and knew that staying calm was the key to survival. Panic killed more men than bullets ever would. "Billy was just a kid," Thornton snarled, rising from his chair, "barely 20 years old. You murdered him in cold blood." "Your brother was old enough to carry a gun and call out a man," Miguel replied. "That made him old enough to face the consequences. I didn't want that fight, but I finished it when he forced my hand." The saloon had gone completely silent, except for the steady tick of a clock on the wall and the distant sound of horses moving in the street outside. Even the piano player had stopped, his hands frozen above the keys as he watched the drama unfold. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come, assuming any of them lived to tell the tale. Thornton's face flushed red with anger and whiskey. "You think you're something special because you can quick draw that iron? Well, let me tell you something, Apache. There's 4 of us and 1 of you. Those ain't odds even a ghost can beat." Miguel's dark eyes moved from man to man, calculating distances, angles, and the likely sequence of events if shooting started. The man to his left was nervous, probably inexperienced. He would be slow on the draw. The one by the door looked competent but overconfident. The third man, standing near the stairs, kept touching his gun nervously, which meant he was probably fast but jumpy. Thornton himself was drunk enough to be unpredictable, but steady enough to be dangerous. 4 men, Miguel said quietly. 4 graves. Your choice. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Every person in the saloon held their breath, waiting for the moment when talking would end and gunpowder would speak. Miguel had long ago accepted that his life would probably end in a moment like this one. The only question was whether he would take his killers with him when he fell. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, its mournful cry echoing off the canyon walls that surrounded Copper Creek. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the moment frozen. Thornton's hand moved toward his gun, and Miguel's world narrowed to the space between heartbeats, where life and death balanced on the edge of a blade. The first shot shattered the silence like thunder breaking over the desert. Miguel's Colt had cleared leather and fired before Thornton's gun was halfway out of its holster. The bullet took the drunk man in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor in a spreading pool of blood. But Miguel was already moving, diving sideways as the other 3 men opened fire. Wood splinters exploded from the bar where Miguel had been standing. The nervous man by the door had rushed his shot, putting his bullet into the wall 6 feet to the left of his target. The man near the stairs was more accurate, his shot burning past Miguel's ear close enough to singe his hair. The third man, the one Miguel had judged overconfident, proved that assessment correct by taking too much time to aim. His hesitation cost him his life as Miguel's second shot punched through his heart. Rolling behind an overturned table, Miguel reloaded with practiced speed, while bullets chewed up the wood around him. 2 men down, 2 to go, but his position was far from secure. The remaining gunmen had taken cover and were now trying to flank him from both sides. Miguel knew he had perhaps 30 seconds before they worked up the courage for a coordinated rush that would likely end with him being shot to pieces. The nervous man made the mistake of showing too much of himself while trying to get a better angle. Miguel's third shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him completely. The wounded man's return fire went wild, shattering bottles behind the bar and causing the bartender to dive for cover behind a stack of beer kegs. Now it was down to Miguel and the man by the stairs, and this one had proven himself to be competent and careful. Miguel could hear him moving, trying to get a clear shot while staying protected. This was the kind of opponent who could kill you if you gave him the slightest opening. Miguel would have to be perfect to survive the next few minutes. The clock on the wall continued its steady ticking, marking time that might be running out for everyone in the saloon. Miguel closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds around him, trying to pinpoint his remaining opponent's exact position. In that moment of stillness, he could almost hear his Apache grandfather's voice, teaching him to become one with his surroundings, to let the land itself guide his actions. When Miguel opened his eyes, he knew exactly where his enemy was hiding and exactly what he had to do to end this fight. The wolf outside howled again, and this time Miguel took it as a sign that the spirits of his ancestors were watching over him. It was time to finish what Jake Thornton had started with his accusations and his thirst for revenge. The standoff stretched like taffy in the summer heat. Miguel remained crouched behind the overturned table, his breathing slow and controlled despite the chaos that had just erupted around him. The man by the stairs, whose name was Carson Wade, had proven himself to be a different breed of gunfighter than his dead companions. Where they had been reckless and emotional, Wade was calculating and patient. This made him far more dangerous than all the others combined. Wade had been a bounty hunter for the better part of 15 years, tracking men across territories and bringing them back dead or alive, depending on what paid better. He had joined Thornton's group not out of loyalty or friendship, but because there was a price on Miguel's head that would keep Wade comfortable for several months. Now, with 3 men dead and the saloon looking like a battlefield, Wade was beginning to wonder if the bounty money would be worth the risk. The wounded man near the door was making soft whimpering sounds as he tried to stop the bleeding from his shoulder wound. Miguel could have finished him with an easy shot, but something in the man's terrified eyes reminded him of his own younger self, scared and alone in a world that seemed determined to destroy him. Sometimes mercy was a luxury a man couldn't afford, but today Miguel chose to let the wounded man live with his fear and his pain. "You're pretty good with that iron, Apache," Wade called out from his position behind a thick wooden pillar. "But you're trapped in here with nowhere to run. Why don't you make this easy on yourself and surrender?" "Maybe the law will go easy on you for killing these men in self-defense." Miguel almost laughed at the suggestion. He had seen enough frontier justice to know that his Apache blood would weigh more heavily in any trial than the circumstances of the shooting. White men might get the benefit of the doubt in a case of self-defense, but an Apache gunslinger would face a rope regardless of who had started the trouble. Wade was either naive or trying to lull him into a false sense of security. "The only law out here is what a man carries in his holster," Miguel replied, checking the remaining bullets in his cylinder. "And I've got enough law left to finish this conversation." The truth was that Miguel was in a difficult position. Wade had chosen his cover well, using the pillar to protect himself while maintaining a clear view of most of the saloon. Any move Miguel made would expose him to Wade's gun, but staying put would only give the bounty hunter time to think of a better plan. Sometimes the only way out of a trap was to spring it yourself and hope you were faster than the jaws closing around you. Outside the saloon, Miguel could hear voices gathering. The townspeople of Copper Creek were stirring, drawn by the sound of gunfire, but too smart to come charging through the batwing doors while lead was still flying. Soon, though, curiosity would overcome caution, and Miguel would find himself facing not just Wade, but potentially an entire town full of angry citizens looking for someone to blame for the violence in their streets. The wounded man by the door was trying to crawl toward the exit, leaving a trail of blood on the saloon floor. His movement caught Wade's attention for a split second, and in that moment of distraction, Miguel made his play. He rolled out from behind the table, coming up on one knee with his Colt extended, and put a bullet through the wooden pillar just inches from where Wade's head had been visible. Wade's return shot splintered the floorboards where Miguel had been kneeling, but the Apache gunslinger was already moving again, using the smoke and confusion to change positions. This deadly dance continued for several more exchanges, each man trying to gain an advantage while staying alive in a game where the smallest mistake would be fatal. The bartender, Eddie Morse, had managed to work his way behind the bar to where he kept a loaded shotgun for emergencies exactly like this one. His hands shook as he gripped the weapon, torn between self-preservation and a growing sense that he should try to end this bloodshed before it claimed any more lives. Eddie had seen enough violence in his 43 years to know that it rarely solved anything and usually just created more problems for everyone involved. Miguel sensed the bartender's presence and the threat he represented, but he couldn't spare the attention to deal with Eddie while Wade was still hunting him. This was the kind of situation where a man's luck could run out in the space between one heartbeat and the next. All it would take was one moment of inattention, one slight miscalculation, and Miguel Santos would join his ancestors in whatever place they went after the shooting stopped. Wade was beginning to realize that he had underestimated his opponent. The Apache moved like smoke through the saloon, appearing and disappearing behind cover with a fluidity that spoke of years spent perfecting the art of staying alive against impossible odds. Each shot Wade fired seemed to miss by inches, while Miguel's bullets came closer and closer to finding their mark. It was becoming clear that one of them would die in the next few minutes, and Wade was no longer confident about which one it would be. The wounded man finally reached the batwing doors and stumbled out into the street, where eager hands pulled him to safety. His escape seemed to break some invisible barrier that had been holding the townspeople back. Voices grew louder outside, and Miguel could make out individual words now: Apache, killer, get the sheriff, and rope. None of these words suggested that his situation was likely to improve when the shooting stopped. Sheriff Tom Bradley was already pushing through the crowd that had gathered outside the Silver Dollar Saloon. He was a fair man by frontier standards, but he was also practical enough to understand the political realities of his position. The death of 4 white men at the hands of an Apache gunslinger would require some kind of justice, even if that justice came at the end of a vigilante's rope rather than through a proper trial. Bradley's job was to keep the peace, and sometimes that meant making decisions that weighed heavily on his conscience. Inside the saloon, the chess match between Miguel and Wade had reached its critical phase. Both men were running low on ammunition, and both understood that the next few shots would likely decide who walked out alive and who remained behind to feed the crows. Wade had worked his way around to a position where he could see most of Miguel's hiding places, while Miguel had managed to put himself within striking distance of Wade's pillar. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight enough to snap. Even the townspeople outside seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the final act of this deadly drama to play out. Miguel thought of Luna, tied to the hitching post outside and probably sensing the violence through the walls. If he died here, she would either be claimed by some opportunistic horse thief or left to fend for herself in a world that was harsh enough for humans, let alone animals. Wade made his move first, stepping out from behind the pillar with his gun extended, confident that he had finally cornered his prey. But Miguel had anticipated this exact moment and was ready with a response that had been years in the making. His Colt spoke once more, and Carson Wade's career as a bounty hunter came to an abrupt and permanent end. The echo of that final gunshot faded slowly, leaving behind a silence that felt different from all the others that had come before it. This was the silence that follows completion. The quiet that comes when a story has reached its natural conclusion. Miguel stood alone among the bodies of 4 men who had chosen to test their luck against his skill and found themselves wanting. But even as he reloaded his gun and prepared to face whatever came next, Miguel knew that this victory was only temporary. Outside those bat-winged doors waited a town full of people who saw him as a dangerous killer who needed to be stopped. The real test of his survival skills was about to begin, and this time he wouldn't be facing individual gunmen but the collective judgment of an entire community that had already decided his fate. Miguel holstered his Colt and surveyed the carnage around him. 4 men lay dead, their blood seeping into the sawdust that covered the saloon floor. The air hung thick with gun smoke and the metallic scent of spilled blood, while somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll as if marking the passing of souls into whatever realm awaited beyond this life. The Apache Gunslinger felt no satisfaction in what he had done, only the hollow emptiness that always followed such violence. Sheriff Bradley's voice carried through the bat-wing doors, calm but firm. "Miguel Santos, I know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible and we'll talk this through like civilized men." The irony wasn't lost on Miguel. Civilized men didn't usually end up standing in rooms full of corpses, but he appreciated Bradley's attempt at diplomacy. Through the gaps in the doors, he could see at least 20 townspeople gathered in the street, some carrying rifles and others holding torches that cast dancing shadows on the wooden buildings. Their faces showed the kind of mob mentality that had claimed too many lives across the frontier territories. Eddie Moore slowly emerged from behind the bar, his shotgun forgotten in his terror. His face was pale as bleached bone, and his hands shook as he surveyed the destruction that had turned his quiet saloon into a slaughterhouse. 4 men had walked into his establishment alive just minutes ago, and now their families would be planning funerals instead of homecomings. "They started it," Eddie whispered, more to himself than to Miguel. "Thornton called you out. I heard every word." Miguel nodded but knew that Eddie's testimony wouldn't carry much weight with an angry mob. The truth had a way of getting lost in situations like this, replaced by simpler narratives that satisfied people's need for clear villains and heroes. An Apache gunslinger would always make a convenient villain, regardless of the circumstances that had led to the shooting. The crowd outside was growing restless. Miguel could hear individual voices calling for justice, for vengeance, for blood to answer blood. Someone suggested getting rope from the livery stable, while another voice proposed burning the saloon down with the Apache still inside. Sheriff Bradley was doing his best to maintain order, but his authority only extended so far when emotions ran this high. Miguel walked to the back of the saloon where a small window looked out onto an alley that ran behind the main street businesses. The window was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, but it represented his only chance of escaping without facing the mob that waited out front. He could hear Luna nickering softly from the hitching post, sensing his distress through the walls that separated them. Before making his move, Miguel took one last look at the 4 dead men. Jake Thornton lay on his back with his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling, his quest for revenge having ended in the same place as his brother's life. Carson Wade had fallen forward, his bounty hunter's instincts finally failing him when it mattered most. The other 2 men looked younger in death, their faces peaceful now that the violence and hatred had drained away with their blood. The Apache gunslinger had learned long ago not to dwell on the men he had killed in self-defense. But he always took a moment to acknowledge their humanity. They had been sons, perhaps brothers or fathers, Men with hopes and dreams that would never be fulfilled because they had chosen to test their luck against his skill. Miguel whispered a brief prayer in the Apache tongue, asking the spirits to guide these men to whatever rest awaited them. The window opened with a soft creak that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Miguel squeezed through the narrow opening and dropped into the alley, his boots landing silently in the dust. From here, he could work his way around to the front of the building and hopefully reach Luna before the mob realized what was happening. It wasn't much of a plan, but desperation rarely offered luxury options. The alley was dark and filled with the usual debris that accumulated behind frontier businesses. Miguel moved carefully, avoiding broken bottles and scattered trash that might alert anyone to his presence. Every few steps he paused to listen for sounds that might indicate the townspeople were spreading out to surround the building. So far, they seemed focused on the main entrance, but that could change quickly if someone spotted him. As Miguel reached the corner of the building, he could see the crowd gathered in the street. Sheriff Bradley stood on the saloon's front porch, his badge glinting in the torchlight as he tried to maintain some semblance of law and order. The lawman was outnumbered 20-1, and several voices in the crowd were openly challenging his authority to handle the situation through legal channels. "That Apache killed 4 of our friends," shouted a man Miguel recognized as the town's blacksmith. "What's to stop him from killing 4 more tomorrow, or the day after that? Some men are just too dangerous to let live." Other voices joined the blacksmiths, creating a chorus of anger that threatened to overwhelm Bradley's attempts at reason. Miguel could see the situation deteriorating rapidly, and he knew that his window of opportunity was closing fast. In another few minutes, someone in that crowd would suggest checking the back of the building, and then his escape route would be cut off completely. Luna stood exactly where he had left her, her dark eyes alert but calm despite the chaos surrounding them. The paint mare had been through situations like this before, and trusted Miguel to get them both out safely. As he approached, she nickered softly in greeting, and Miguel felt a wave of affection for this loyal companion who had shared so many dangers with him over the years. Miguel untied Luna's reins with steady hands, despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. The crowd was focused on Sheriff Bradley's words, giving the Apache Gunslinger a few precious moments to mount up and plan his next move. Once he was in the saddle, he would have to ride hard and fast to get clear of town before the mob realized he had escaped. Sheriff Bradley's voice carried clearly in the night air. "I understand your anger, folks, but we do things legal in this town. Santos will face trial for what happened here tonight, and if he's found guilty, he'll pay the price according to law." A woman's voice cut through the crowd's murmur. "What if he escapes before trial? What if he runs off into the desert and we never see him again? Those 4 men will still be just as dead, and their killer will be free to murder again, somewhere else." The woman's words struck home with several members of the crowd, and Miguel could see the mood shifting toward immediate action rather than waiting for legal proceedings. This was exactly the kind of situation that had claimed so many lives across the frontier, where fear and anger overruled reason and justice became whatever the strongest group decided it should be. Miguel guided Luna away from the hitching post, moving slowly to avoid attracting attention. The horses' hooves made soft sounds in the dust, barely audible above the crowd's increasingly heated discussion. They had covered perhaps 20 yards when a voice from the edge of the mob called out a warning that sent ice through Miguel's veins. "There he is! The Apache's getting away!" The crowd turned as one entity, 20 faces swiveling toward Miguel and Luna like sunflowers following the movement of the sun. For a moment, time seemed suspended, with both sides recognizing that the situation had just changed dramatically. Then someone raised a rifle, and Miguel knew that the talking was over. He spurred Luna into a gallop just as the first shot rang out, the bullet whistling past his head close enough to part his hair. The paint mare responded instantly, her powerful legs carrying them down the street at a speed that made accurate shooting difficult in the flickering torchlight. More shots followed, some coming close enough to make Miguel duck low in the saddle. The edge of town appeared ahead of them, marked by the last few buildings before Copper Creek gave way to open desert. Miguel could hear horses being saddled behind him as the more organized members of the mob prepared to give chase. A pursuit across the desert at night would be dangerous for everyone involved, but Miguel knew these people well enough to understand that danger wouldn't stop them from trying to run him down. Luna carried him past the last building and onto the desert trail that led away from Copper Creek. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see the path but also making Miguel visible to anyone who might be following. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were already beginning as horses and riders started after them into the wilderness that stretched endlessly under the star-filled sky. Miguel leaned forward in the saddle, speaking softly to Luna in the Apache tongue, encouraging her to find the reserves of speed and endurance that would carry them to safety. The desert ahead held its own dangers, from flash floods to rattlesnakes, to the ever-present threat of Apache war parties who might not distinguish between him and the white settlers he was fleeing. But the desert also offered freedom, vast spaces where a man could disappear if he knew the land well enough. As Copper Creek fell behind them and the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, Miguel allowed himself to hope that he might live to see another sunrise. The wolf that had been howling earlier called out again from somewhere in the darkness, its voice carrying across the desert like a benediction. The Apache Gunslinger took it as a good sign, a message from the spirits that his ancestors were still watching over him in this harsh land where survival often came down to nothing more than luck and the will to keep riding into the unknown.